Hey, I'm Mr. Williamson. This video is about the history of evolution, or how did we get to where we are while we're talking about evolution. Before we get started, make sure you're taking good notes. I know you've heard me say it 40 times because that's how many videos I think we've had. Cornell style works really well, but you do whatever it takes out your trash. I'm good with it. Just make sure you turn it in when you turn in the assignment. Let's get started. First of all, Aristotle, who lived in ancient Greece, so roughly 2,500 years ago in Greece, believed in spontaneous generation, a life from no life, and he had this idea. Aristotle basically was a teacher, a philosopher, and he would take classes out on walks, nature walks, and they would discuss what they saw in life. And that's how they came up with their ideas. So he believed, in the spring, after a hot summer, and Greece gets pretty hot and sometimes it's very dry, he would see a dried up mud puddle, a dried up pond, and there's no life there. There's no fish. There's nothing living there because it's dry. Or maybe it's like this, where the pond is dried up, but there's a little bit of water, but there's nothing living in it. And then his class would come back in the spring after the rains had come, the water had warmed up, and the pond had filled back up, and he found all kinds of life. He found the frogs over here, the common frog, and probably once in a while an uncommon frog. He found yellow water lilies over here, which if I color it, now it's pink water lily. Okay, and then he had like white water lilies here, which if I color it, it's a pink water lily, so it's just the color of the water lily. But basically what he said was, that from the dried up mud, the mud of the pond, life grew. Like the frogs and the fish and the tadpoles, which actually turn into frogs, came, and so life came from the earth. Spontaneous generation. Spontaneous meaning that it happened, without any idea, without any planning or anything like that. And generation is created. All right, we call that abiogenesis. The prefix a means without. Biogenesis, bio, the start of life. Bio, life. Genesis, beginning or creation. So abiogenesis is life from no life. That is false. Okay, then we come up to Francisco Redi in 1660s. So, like 100 years after we created our nation, he showed that all life came from previous life. And it's been disputed for a long time. But the way he did it was he basically took jars and he put meat into them. And you hopefully that rotting meat attracts flies. All right. Well, when he sealed them up, so all of these are sealed. And you can see there are no flies because there's no maggots, no flies. The flies are not able to get in there. But then he put like gauze. He put gauze over the top, meaning the flies could still smell the meat and they were attracted to the decaying meat, and they would lay their eggs on top of the gauze and the maggots would appear. So the maggots formed when they could smell it. And then when he left the gauze off, the flies would come in and lay their eggs on the meat, and the maggots came from the meat. Well, what was before that, people thought, well, the maggots come from the meat. And he said, no, they come from the flies. And he proved that by putting the gauze over it and sealing them. If you seal it, the flies don't appear, they don't come because they can't smell it, and no maggots appeared. And people argued with him, said, yeah, no, that's because there's no air in the jar, and therefore the no life can be created. And that's why he put the gauze over. He said, look, there's air able to get into the jar, but the flies can't. All right. And so they kind of agreed, okay, maybe the bigger organisms, the multicellular organisms could still, were created from previous life, but not the microscopic things, the things that you can't see, the microorganisms. Until 1668, Louis Pasteur came along, and I actually think it's 1768. I think that year's wrong. That's okay. I'll probably put in some kind of like tag thing over here or there, whatever. I don't know. Anyways, he showed that all life comes from previous life. When he did this experiment, he took a flask full of broth, like like beef broth, chicken broth, something like that. Microorganisms, bacteria love, fungus loves that kind of thing. A lot of nutrients in broth. So he would boil it. When you boil something, you sterilize it. That's why you boil things. If you want to sterilize them, you boil them. And what he did was left the top open. If you leave the top open, the microorganisms can float in and it becomes infected and it becomes organisms appear. Then he sealed it off. Same flask, different flask, same kind of flask, broth, sealed it off so there's no air able to get into it and no organisms appeared. And again, you can figure what people said. Well, no organisms appear because there's no air, there's no oxygen, and they need to have oxygen. So he took the neck of it and he drew it out, heated it up, and he stretched it out and drew a tube. So the air was still able to get in, the flow of air was still able to get in, but because microorganisms are not floating in the air, they're actually floating on dust. When you see dust, if anything kind of, if you get an infection from something, it's probably because dust got in. The bacteria don't float around on their own. They float actually attached to something, usually dust or human skin cells, which is like 80% of dust. So when you look in the window and the sunlight streaming through the window, you see all the little dust particles floating around. Usually it's human skin. So look at that. That's part of your family floating right there. Anyways, he drew it out. The dust couldn't get in until finally he actually drew it, and he drew the S shape. And he found that what happened is the dust would collect on the bottom down there, but it wasn't able to make it up to the top. And then on some of the flasks they did, he would tilt them so that the broth would actually go into there, collect down there, and then come back, and it became infected, or things grew. Or he would break off the whole thing, and things grew. It was only when he opened it up to the air dropping directly into the flask did things grow in the broth. And there are actually some of his original flasks from, again, the year would be right up here somewhere. The flasks originally, his original flasks still have no microorganisms growing in them because they have not been infected. So he showed that life does not come from life. I mean, showed that all life comes from life. Life does not spontaneously generations. Biogenesis, not abiogenesis. And then so that's how we showed that life comes from life. 1693, a gentleman called John Ray, I just refer to him as J. Ray, he developed the concept of species. Species is, we're going to learn in detail, but species are organisms that can interbreed with each other. And he pointed out that variations exist. No two individuals, even in a species, are identical. So we look at these clams, and I forget the name of them, the clams. When I made this, I remembered. Again, I might put something up here, or not in this case. These are the same species of clam, but they all look different. Why? Variation. All right? Here is the same species of butterfly, and hopefully you can see they all look very similar, but they're all different. If we were in class, this is about the time I'd say, look around the room. No one looks exactly like you. And the rest of us are very thankful for that, because if you looked in the mirror, really, nobody wants to look like that. My point is that, every organism is different. There's always variations in different organisms. Carolus Linnaeus. I have no idea why you'd name your boy Carolus, but, who cares? He started categorizing animals by function, not structure. This isn't as important to you this year because he's the one that came up with the taxonomy, putting things together by function, like all the insects go together and all the tigers and cats go together and all the dogs and things go together. He came up with categorizing animals. Don't worry too much about him. William Smith, he established geologic dating by stratification. If you don't know what geological dating is, that's where you're out on a date and you realize that the person you're out with is as dumb as a rock. Geological dating. You'll get it later. If you don't get it, maybe you're the one who's, Anyways, he pointed out the stratification that we can date geological features by stratification. Stratification is the layering of rock. So what he talked about was the rock down here is older than the rock up here. The higher up you go, the younger the rock. This rock over here, well, I got to pick a color you can see it. There we go. This rock over here is younger than the rock here. The farther down you go, the older the rock. You already knew that because you have seen piles of laundry. This may actually be your garage. Again, he's basically saying that the rock down here, the laundry in the middle, the bottom of the pile, is older than the laundry on the top of the pile. Common sense in my mind. Maybe not. I could be wrong. But the farther down you go into the pile of laundry, the older the clothes get. The farther down you go into the earth, the layers of rock, the older the rocks get. By doing that, we can date how old things are. George Cuvier was the first person to compare fossils to present-day life forms. He looked at fossil bones and fossils, and he said, oh, look, that's really similar to something we have now. For instance, Archaeopteryx, which is this organism over here. That's Archaeopteryx, which is a fossilized, it's the remains of a bird and a reptile. It's a cross between a bird and a reptile. Okay, kind of like the missing link between the two. And a chicken. Chicken on the right. All right. Archaeopteryx, when we look at the actual fossil of it, looks something like this. And you can actually see in the rock, you can see that it had feathers. It had claw-like hands, all right, which a bird does not have. It had a tail, which a bird does have, but it's not as long as Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx had a lot of features that were very bird-like, but were also had a lot of features that were reptilian. So it was kind of like showing like this is the link between the two. All right. And if we go on, this is an artist's rendition based on the structures that they have found of what that organism would look like, the Archaeopteryx. All right. And it had, by the way, teeth. Chickens don't have teeth. Birds don't have teeth. But they had teeth. They had conical teeth. Teeth very similar to alligators and crocodiles. And if we look at the organism, what we could find, we can actually see that it had the feathers. It had claws like a bird. It had claws like its forelimbs, limbs like a reptile, but the feathers like a bird. The tail like a reptile, but it was feathered. It had a lightweight body. So it had a lot of reptilian features, a lot of bird features. Cuvier was the one that came up with comparing fossils to present-day life forms. And then it brings us to JeanLamarck. It's not Jean. It's not Jean, guys. You wear jeans. This is Jean. He's French. Just go with it. All right. He had the first hypothesis of evolution. He said acquired characteristics are passed on to offspring. He was on the right track, but he was on the wrong train. He was heading the right direction, but the train wasn't going where he wanted it to go. And I'll show you why. Okay, he said acquired characteristics. Acquired characteristics. Let's take a look at that. Lamarck had this theory, this idea that you use it, it got bigger. Okay, so why do giraffes have such long necks? Well, because they stretch their neck up to eat the tree, the leaves of the higher part of the tree. So as they stretched their neck up, their neck would get longer as they got older. And when they had children or when they had offspring, the offspring would be born with a longer neck. So by stretching their neck up to get the food, that caused their neck to get longer, and then their children, their offspring, had longer necks. So use it or lose it. A lizard has legs. Now, if this is a western alligator lizard, so it's probably not living in the brush, but let's say the lizard lives in the grass or in the bushes. Well, those legs might get in the way of trying to get away from something or catch something. So they would tuck their legs in against their body and not use them as legs and slither more like a snake. Well, if you don't use it, it gets smaller. And some of you have probably seen that. Have you ever broken an arm or a leg and they put it in a cast for 6 weeks? When they took the cast off, what did you notice about your arm or your leg? It was probably smaller. That's called atrophy. Okay? Your muscles, if you don't use them, they get smaller. All right? So you don't use your muscles, you lose it. If you do something, you get, you work out, you use your muscles, you get it. Use it or lose it. That was Lamarck's idea. All right? So the lizard because after its next generation, or many generations, the legs got smaller and smaller and smaller, became a snake. That was Lamarck's idea. The giraffe grew its neck by stretching its neck up and passing those characteristics on to their offspring. The lizard did not use its legs, and therefore its offspring slowly became a snake. Okay? Well, like I said, right track, wrong train. Here's the problem. 3 blind mice. Okay, 3 blind. I'm sure you've heard the nursery rhyme, although recently I found out that you guys don't know anything about nursery rhymes, but let's pretend like you do. 3 blind mice, see how they run, see how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife who cut off the tails with a carving knife. I have no idea why nursery rhymes are so violent. They're just freaking violent. You know, look at Rockabye Baby in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. Down will fall baby, cradle and all. Good night, kid. You just told your baby that if the wind blows, the cradle will come crashing down and kill you. What kind of... And then you say, well, good night. You know, what the hell? And here we've got some lady who's running, being chased by mice, and she's cutting their tail off with a carving knife. Violence. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That's a story about the plague. It's a nursery rhyme. What the hell? What was wrong with these people when they wrote this stuff? Anyways, here's the thing. If you cut off a tail of a mouse, let's say of the 3 blind mice, these guys are over here. They're in an interesting relationship. At least one of them's female. So like they're having babies, and I cut off all their tails, all 3 of them. What will the next generation have? Tails or no tails? I'll tell you. They'll have tails. And I cut off all those tails, and I let them interbreed. They'll all have tails. I could do that for thousands and thousands of generations, and the next generation will always have tails. Always. Do you have a scar? Have you got, a cut maybe when you were a little kid? Did you scrape your knee really bad as a little kid? Do you have a scar on your body somewhere? Is your kid going to have that scar? No. No, it's not. No. You know why? Because she's on the right track, but the wrong train. Those are acquired characteristics. What haven't we changed? We haven't changed the genetics. Okay? When you cut off the tails of the carving knife, you don't change the genes. The DNA still says grow a tail. When you have kids, you're not going to have some kind of gene in there that says have a scar. You haven't changed the genes. He was on the right track. Characteristics are passed on to the next generation. But he's on the wrong train, meaning not acquired characteristics. Characteristics are passed on, but not acquired characteristics. Not the characteristics or things that you get during your life. All right? And that's going to bring us to the next video where we talk about Darwin. Hopefully, you took the notes. Real quickly, we talked a little bit about the history of Aristotle, and he was way off base. Cuvier, who talked about fossils. We talked about J. Ray, speciation and variation. That's an important one. You probably ought to know him. John Ray, he was the one that came up with the variations in species. And finally, Lamarck, who was not correct. He was close, but he was not correct. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me at Ed Puzzle or in class. Good luck.